I want to just thank our good friends and colleagues at Meiji University, and also thank the US Embassy in Tokyo, which has been a great sponsor of our work and our partnership with Meiji University. So I'll just say that much because I think what we all want to hear about is some historical view of our collections. Rob's research is very interesting. I'm very proud to have him a colleague here in our Asian Cultural History program. And his work reflects not only his great interest and many discoveries in the field of Japanese cultural heritage, but also we can say the more recent interest that has grown about what our collections of material culture and modes of selection, ideas about how they're represented and assembled, tell us about our own collecting instincts and our own cultures in interaction with global peoples worldwide. And that's something that he has observed and has written about in a very interesting way. We look forward to hearing his talk in our bilingual format that we're trying today, which is pre-recorded with subtitles. And he will be here afterwards for all the questions and answers. And I do hope that everybody will feel free to speak up and comment or ask any questions. And you're also free to use the chat box. Thank you very much. And it's great to be back for our Tuesday mornings in Tokyo webinar series.
本日はご参加いただきありがとうございます。6ヶ月ぶりのオンラインセミナーなんですけども、本日はスミソニアンの方からロバート・ポンツィオンさんを迎えまして、セミナーを行わせていただきます。で、本日はですね、明治大学の方と、あとアメリカ大使館の方のご協力いただいております。ありがとうございます。今回のセミナーはですね、まず歴史的な視点からどのようにスミソニアンのコレクション収蔵物っていうか収集が行われてきたかっていう視点も持ちながら、特に日本とのコレクションの方の焦点を与えながらのお話になります。で、特にその中ではですね、どのようにコレクションの、方針が変わっていったのか、どういうことが起こっていたのかということと、あとそのスミソニアンがどのように世界各地と、特にコンタクトを持ってきたのか、してきたのかということについての視点も話していただけると思います。で、今回のセミナーは今までとやり方が同じ一つでありまして、2カ国語でやるフォーマットになります。そのためにですね、事前に録画を一旦しまして、そこに字幕をつける形で、本日のセミナーの方は行わせていただく形になっております。ですのでですね、ちょっと最初に字幕を載せたセミナーのビデオの方を上映させていただきまして、でその後に質疑応答の時間をいただければと思います。ですので、ご自由にですね、ぜひ気兼ねせず、直接質問で、質問の時間はですね、通訳もつけますし、であとチャットボックスを使ってくださって質問をしてくださっても構いません。それではですね、Do you know or introduce yourself like Robert to everybody?
Hi, everyone, and good evening in North America. Ohayo gozaimasu in Japan. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for coming. I'm very excited today to talk about these three collections from Japan that are at the Smithsonian, and to hopefully engage some discussion after. So if anyone has any questions, as Paul and Toru mentioned, please do put them in the chat box, or even better, if you can turn on your video and yeah, let's have an engaging conversation, hopefully. So that's all I really want to say, and just looking forward to speaking with everyone after the seminar.
ございます。北アメリカではこんばんはという、で日本ではおはようございますっていう時間帯なんですけども、本日はスミソニアンのタイトルの通り、日本コレクションということで3つの日本コレクションについてお話をさせていただきます。でそうですね、特に最後のところで、質疑応答を楽しみにしてますので、やり取りを。それではよろしくお願いします。 All right, so I'll start the video, then please enjoy. The subtitle will come on the top. 字幕は上の方に始めます。それではビデオを始めさせていただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Hello, and welcome to 3 Smithsonian Collections from Japan, 1859, 1923, 1965. Shifting Rationales for Collecting at America's National Museum. My name is Dr. Robert Pontsioen, and I'm a senior researcher in the Smithsonian's Asian Cultural History program. I completed my PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland in 2012, and my doctoral research focused on communities of traditional craft makers in Tokyo, which has led to my wider interest in Japanese material culture, including historical Japanese materials and how they're preserved and studied and exhibited at museums. In this talk, I'll share the stories of 3 different Smithsonian collections of Japanese objects to consider how and why these particular objects ended up in the national collections of the United States, and to briefly consider what this can tell us about the nature of collecting, particularly for natural history museums during this 100-year period. Our story begins with the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu to power in Japan in the early 1600s. This ended centuries of civil war in Japan and ushered in a 250-year period of relative peace known as the Tokugawa period, or the Edo period, after the name of the city in which Ieyasu founded his capital. In order to maintain stability and solidify the rule of the Tokugawa clan, Ieyasu and his successors instituted a number of reforms in Japan. One of these was a series of Tokugawa edicts in the mid-1600s that led to the implementation of the sakoku, or isolation policy, under which no foreigner could enter, nor could any Japanese leave Japan on penalty of death. Although the samurai were celebrated warriors, for a number of reasons, the Tokugawa regime had difficulties when it came to running the country during peacetime. Perhaps the biggest problem for the samurai rulers was their inability to fully understand and manage an increasingly massive cash-based economy. This led to food shortages and food riots in the 18th and early 19th centuries, as well as many impoverished and disaffected samurai and general economic malaise throughout the country. Despite these challenges, after more than 200 years of relative peace, in the 1830s and 1840s, there were few signs that the Tokugawa government might somehow suddenly collapse. Ultimately, the issue was forced by the arrival of an American squadron of steam-powered warships led by Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry during his visits in 1853 and 1854. And this also resulted in the first Smithsonian collection I want to talk about today. Perry had been ordered by President Millard Fillmore to pull out all the stops to ensure the Japanese open diplomatic and trade relations with the United States. Although many of the samurai remained reluctant to engage the foreigners, they quickly realized that they would be unable to defend against the massive guns and advanced technology of the Americans. This was largely due to the fact that during the mostly peaceful Tokugawa years, they hadn't been developing new military technologies or tactics. The initial encounters between Perry's fleet and the samurai of Japan led to a fascinating gift exchange. On the American side, Perry sought to impress the Japanese with American luxury goods, and especially with modern weaponry, science, and technology, including a miniature steam engine, 2 telegraph sets with 3 miles of wire, dozens of books on science, law, and history, a barrel of whiskey, a modern telescope, 6 dozen assorted perfumes, ostensibly for the Empress of Japan, 12 cavalry swords, 6 artillery swords, 5 rifles, and 20 pistols. Some of these gifts are pictured here in this woodblock print by an unknown Japanese artist around the time of the Perry expedition. For their part, as we'll see, the Japanese gave to the Americans objects of samurai culture, meant to demonstrate the sophisticated and highly refined art of the Japanese. As Perry's expedition took place just 2 years before the completion of the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C., The 400 or so items he brought back formed one of the first collections to be housed in the new Smithsonian building. In this way, the Perry collection from Japan became the very first collection to be entered into the earliest Smithsonian Ethnology Record Book from 1857. These objects are labeled 1 through 400 of what are now more than 450,000 anthropological artifacts in the museum's collections. The Japanese gifts included some 40 bamboo fans, including this exquisite example featuring a beautiful portrait of a woman by Utagawa Kuniyoshi on one side, and on the other side, a print of a painting by Hiroshige II. It's noteworthy that some of these fans, including this example, feature works by some of the most famous artists in Japan, and surely would have been considered highly valuable by the Japanese, although unfortunately, as we'll see, the Americans didn't recognize this value at the time. The gifts included more than 50 umbrellas, which were often presented as official gifts, alongside precious textiles, such as the 25 rolls of silk that were also included. Interestingly, several dolls were included in the gift, such as this palace doll, or Gosho Ningyo. The reason these dolls were included is likely because Edo period palace dolls were traditionally given as gifts by members of the imperial household and other nobles. In America, however, dolls were considered little more than children's toys, and these items were therefore likely unappreciated by Perry and his men. Numerous examples of pottery, ceramics, and lacquerware form an important part of the collection. And many of these items, including this Susuribako, or lacquered inkstone box, remain as beautiful today as they were when gifted to Commodore Perry, which is a testament to their craftsmanship and durability. The items brought back to the US by Perry also include a number of purchases, which primarily include agricultural implements and tools of various kinds, as can be seen here, which the US government desired in order to be able to assess Japan's industrial and agricultural technologies and capacities. Finally, the Japanese gifts included 2 swords, which obviously held special significance among the samurai, though once again this cultural context was missed by the American recipients. Indeed, as I've mentioned above, according to most accounts, the Americans at the time were not particularly impressed with these gifts. For example, Lieutenant George Henry Preble, who escorted Perry ashore to receive the gifts, wrote the following in his journal, quote, "The gifts were not worth over $1,000, some thought. I am sure that one of our presents of Audubon's great work on American birds was worth more than all we saw there, and our miniature steam engine and car cost several times their value. Everyone, the Commodore included, remarked on the meager display. I think these presents will prove a great disappointment to our people, whose ideas of Japan have been so exaggerated." End quote. Not all of the Americans were disappointed with the gifts presented by the Japanese, however. Midshipman John Glendy Sproston observed, quote, "The first objects that attracted my attention were lacquered boxes of different sizes and shapes, embracing several varieties of style. Their quality was evidently very superior and beautiful, evidently excelling every other nation. Of more beautiful varieties, no other nation can produce them." End quote. Over time, many of the objects in the Perry collection have gained more respect as more about them has been learned. For example, the short sword or wakizashi pictured here was inspected in 1972 by a representative from the Japanese Art Sword Association and determined to be made by master swordsmith Setsu Shinsa around the year 1600, making it a blade of very high quality and great historical significance. Of course, Perry and his men didn't know this, but you can understand how the samurai would have considered the sword to be a very precious and valuable gift. For their part, the Japanese were impressed with Perry and his gifts. Many woodblock prints were produced of Perry and his men and ships, including this interesting example. As you can see, it is quite an accurate depiction in most ways, apart from one. The artist had likely heard that Perry had blue eyes, but having not seen him up close, decided that the whites of his eyes must be blue, rather than the irises. In reacting to the Americans' gifts, the steam power technology and advanced weaponry presented by the Americans indicated for many Japanese the likely futility of attempting to continue the Sakoku policy and keep the Americans at bay by force. In this way, Perry's arrival was a major factor in sparking what has become known as the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which saw the last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, ultimately relinquish power to the young Emperor Meiji. This meant that over 700 years of samurai rule came to an end, and Japan's borders were opened to the outside world once more. In the decades that followed, a massive influx of visitors arrived in Japan, and one such visitor, who lived in Japan in 1887 and 1888, was responsible for amassing the second Smithsonian collection I want to discuss today. The donor was a woman named Cassie Mason Myers Julian James, who bequeathed a large collection of some 500 objects to the Smithsonian upon her death in 1921. She was a member of a prominent and wealthy military family whose father, Theodorus Bailey Myers, 1821 to 1888, served as a quartermaster during the Civil War, wrote many articles on American history, and was also a lawyer and philanthropist. Her brother was Theodorus Bailey Myers Mason, 1848 to 1899, who was the founder and first head of the Office of Naval Intelligence and a retired lieutenant commander of the U.S. Navy in 1894. When I first started to research the objects in this collection, I was unable to determine which member or members of this family might have been in Japan to acquire the objects and at what time period. This mystery was only solved when I had a chance to visit the Clements Library at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to examine these large scrapbooks of letters and other family memorabilia assembled and donated by Mrs. Julian James to that institution. Among those papers, I discovered a series of 4 letters written by Theodorus Jr. to his family members that prove he was in Japan during the early Meiji period in 1887 and 1888, and further that his wife, Eddie or Edith, was with him for several months. As you can see in the upper right, this letter was sent by Theodorus to his sister, Cassie, from Yokohama on the 11th of June, 1887. It therefore can be assumed that this collection was acquired by Theodorus Jr. and his wife during their stay in Japan in the late 1880s, which is useful information for dating the objects, given that the collection wasn't donated to the Smithsonian until more than 40 years later. Like many collections that have come to museums in this way over the decades, these items reflect the tastes of aristocratic America, especially for things considered exotic. The focus is largely on arms and armor, textiles, costumes, and decorative arts, including lacquer and tortoiseshell works. For example, the collection includes many beautiful textiles, such as this silk embroidered image of a carp. And here's a detail of that piece showing the playful design and vibrant colors that went into the production of this piece. Similarly, we see here an embroidered silk depiction of a traditional Japanese thatched roof dwelling. Not surprisingly, there are several rolls of Japanese silk, which was a highly desired commodity around the world at this time. The collection includes many examples of ceramics, jewelry, and tortoiseshell works, such as these jinriksha models, which were likely created as souvenirs for tourists or an export market. There are also some fascinating household items like toys, such as this model of a kitchen, which, as you can see in this detail image, includes individually carved tiny utensils. Other toys include this stuffed dog that has rather interesting lips, as well as this house model that includes many pieces of furniture, such as tables, chairs, and room dividers. We might speculate that the objects we've seen so far reflected the taste of Theodorus Jr.'s wife, Eddie, though I have found no actual description of how or where in Japan the objects were acquired. In contrast, perhaps reflecting the tastes of Theodorus Jr., one true strength of the collection lies in arms and armor, including the 10 swords seen here, as well as numerous spears, shields, and axes. Some relatively rare weapons include 4 firearms, such as this hand cannon that features an interesting centipede motif you can see here, that might reflect the Japanese mythological Omukade, a giant human eating centipede that is said to live in the mountains. Finally, the collection includes 6 complete or nearly complete suits of samurai armor that remain in excellent condition even today, largely thanks to the innovative storage methods that our conservatives have developed, that you can see here, which prevents stress on the various components as nothing is left hanging down by delicate silk or leather cords. I'd like to skip ahead about 50 years at this point to consider the origins and contents of one final and very interesting collection of Japanese objects held at the National Museum of Natural History. The collection is named after the man who acquired the objects for the Smithsonian, Noma Yoshio, who lived from 1908 until 1990 and was the chairman of the Fukuoka Arts Association between 1952 and 1978. I haven't been able to figure out exactly how they met, but in 1959, Noma was contacted by Eugene Kinez, who had just become curator of Asian ethnology at the National Museum of Natural History, a position he held from 1959 until 1979. Kinez had recently completed a PhD in the anthropology of Korea at Syracuse University, and before that he had been posted in East Asia during World War II and worked for the US government in post-war Korea and Japan. He had written his dissertation on village life in Korea, and his approach to museum collecting and exhibition clearly marked a break with the collecting methods I've previously described. For example, in a letter to a colleague in India, Kinez wrote that he sought, quote, comprehensive sets of objects that would depict particular patterns of behavior rather than luxury items for the well-to-do, end quote. An extensive series of letters between Kinez and Noma from 1959 until 1963 is in the accession file, and they outline how this collection came to be, making this by far the best documented collection of the three in terms of how and why the objects were amassed. In his first letter, written in October of 1959, Kinez writes, Mr. Noma, with your expert assistance, I would very much like to improve the exhibit and research collections here at the National Museum pertaining to the agricultural tools, kitchen utensils, and utility ceramics of Kyushu. Noma had in fact written 2 books by this time about village life in small rice farming and fishing villages in Kyushu, and he replied enthusiastically as follows. I can say yes and okay on the whole to your letter. I am, however, thinking how much you can spend on this purpose. I think it takes about 1 year to collect all the things you want, and I'll have to take several trips to search around for them. The cost depends on quality and quantity of them all. For the moment, all money is not necessary for me at once, but I need it little by little. This began a 4-year odyssey to acquire the collection, with money being a major roadblock most of the time, as Kinez found it extremely difficult to find ways to forward Noma cash before receiving any items, but Noma requiring funds in order to carry out the collecting. Eventually, Kinez found a way through the museum bureaucracy that allowed him to send money, and Noma began to assemble the collection. As per Kinez's instructions, Noma focused primarily on collecting ethnographic objects, which means there are absolutely no weapons included. The collection focuses instead on things like tools, including this piece of chikarazuna, or power rope, which I have been told was suspended from the ceiling for women to hold on to while giving birth. There are many agricultural items, such as this pair of mud shoes or field shoes, which would allow the wearer to walk on top of muddy fields when planting rice without sinking into the muck. And this belly sash for cattle, which though functional, is also quite beautiful. There's also various kitchen utensils like these interesting shell dippers that appear to be well used. Among the many household items contained in the collection is this box of tortoiseshell hair ornaments that include the delicate piece at the bottom, carved to resemble the headstock of a shamisen. He also collected fishing equipment, everyday clothing, and some wonderful toys, such as this brightly painted carved parrot, and this toy whale car, or Kujiraguruma, from Nagasaki. Soon, the objects that Noma was collecting began to pile up in his house as he and Kinez tried to find a way to ship the items to the US. This led to another problem that Noma outlines in his letters to Kinez. Quote, "Since my house is very limited in space, it seems that we are living in the middle of the materials instead of a house. Every time we have a guest in the house, my wife complains about the presence of the materials." End quote. Eventually, much to the relief of Noma's family, surely, the collections were sent to Washington aboard 2 ships in March and September of 1963, and the objects were accessioned into the Smithsonian Collections in 1965, although Kinez's dream of a comprehensive exhibit of Japanese village life unfortunately never materialized. Now that we've explored these collections and how they were formed, to conclude, I'd like to consider why I chose these particular collections to focus on and what they can tell us about the formation of natural history collections during this time period. I selected the Perry collection because it's typical of how the Smithsonian built many of its earliest collections, namely through the accession of diplomatic gifts and other materials brought back by government expeditions and trade missions. It does seem that Commodore Perry was explicitly interested in collecting objects from Japan for a museum, as evidenced by an interesting quote from the diary of S. Wells Williams, who was the chief interpreter on the Perry expedition to Japan. On July 26, 1853, while the expedition was in Naha, Okinawa, he noted that, quote, "The Commodore wished particularly to get a great variety of articles, silks, cottons, lacquered ware, chinaware, and other products, to put in a museum in Washington," end quote. As we saw, the Perry collection indeed includes exquisite lacquerware, textiles, and other objects of high culture or fine art. Although we can only guess at Perry's motivation for wanting to collect Japanese things for the National Museum, it does make sense as the Japan expedition was in part an exploratory mission, and bringing back goods and natural history specimens would allow American scientists and specialists to learn much about potential trade goods, as well as the agricultural and technological capacity of the Japanese. At the same time, the Perry collection was amassed in a rather haphazard way, as the crew purchased whatever was available at the markets they had access to, while the gifts from the shogun form an important early diplomatic collection that can potentially tell us much about the mindset of the last Tokugawa rulers of Japan. But obviously, the Americans were not in a position to demand particular kinds of objects. Overall, it's representative of objects gained through gunboat diplomacy and early government expeditions. On the one hand, this is a great way to develop beautiful collections representing the finest objects from other cultures, but it didn't really suit the purposes of a museum curator like Eugene Kinez, who wanted to depict everyday life in Japan for the American public. The Julian James collection is a good representation of one of the more common collecting methodologies of ethnographic material at the Natural History Museum in the first half of the 20th century. According to this method, wealthy individuals would travel the world, amass often very large collections based on either their own tastes or much more rarely in communication with museum curators. They would then return with these materials and donate them to the museum, or eventually heirs to the estates would donate the objects, as in the case of Mrs. Julian James. This mode of collecting led to the foundational Japanese collections of many major museums in the West, including the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and its collection from Ernest Fenollosa, Edward Morse's collections at Harvard's Peabody Essex Museum, and the Museum of Oriental Art in Venice, which contains items collected by Enrico di Borbone. It must be acknowledged that this collecting method was necessarily facilitated by the expansion of European and American power around the globe during this time, which made it possible for private citizens from the West to visit and live in faraway lands. In contrast with the Perry collection, the Julian James collection was more consciously directed in terms of what objects were collected. But of course, it was strictly a private collection and therefore probably reflects the personal tastes of the collector, as well as what they considered to be sound investments, which were quite typical of wealthy aristocrats of the time in focusing on weapons, curios, silks, and other exotic items. This limited the range of the collection by excluding seemingly common or everyday items, as well as items that might not be readily available for purchase. Certainly, there was no effort to acquire objects that could represent the everyday lives of Japanese people. In addition, the level of contextual documentation for this kind of collection tends to be very limited, with dates and location of purchase often the only information provided by the donor. In the case of the Julian James collection, we don't even have those details. More than 40 years after the donation of the Julian James collection, many of the collecting practices at the Smithsonian had become more intentional and directed by museum specialists. One excellent example of this is the Noma Yoshio collection, which was assembled at the request of a Smithsonian curator by a qualified local ethnologist, which gives it quite a unique character. It's far more specific in its focus on everyday or ethnological items, unlike the previous two collections, and therefore it can give us a good picture of the material culture of the people living in that time and place. One great advantage of this mode of collecting is the nature and amount of information that is often associated with each item. Noma Yoshio, for example, recorded the local names for each object, and he also developed a unique cataloging system that we're still in the process of researching. As a museum researcher who is working on this collection many decades after it was assembled and accessioned, I'm grateful to Eugene Kinez and Noma Yoshio for their work in assembling and preserving this rare snapshot of village life in Kyushu, and I look forward to sharing it through upcoming publications and more seminars like this one. Indeed, I'd argue that the Noma Yoshio collection is a precursor to the kind of collaborative research that has become the norm over the last few decades, in which museum specialists work directly with local artisans, historians, specialists from other cultures, where they study and collect. To conclude, I'd like to point out something that these three collections have in common, which is that they were all acquired by people who are fascinated with Japanese culture and impressed with the unique beauty of Japanese items, whether they be refined works of art or everyday household goods. For the Smithsonian, these collections were all brought into the museum with the ultimate aim of sharing Japanese culture with the American public and to build on the goodwill between the people of our nations. Many thanks for your time and attention. Arigato gozaimashita, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So thank you, Robert, for preparing the wonderful video. ロバートさん、本当にすごい内容の、深いビデオを、準備してくださってありがとうございました。Is there like a, do you want to like does anybody want to start like giving him a comment or questions? It's really interesting. どなたでも誰でもいいのでコメントや質問等もしございましたらぜひ、私もたくさんあるんですけども、はい、チャットでもはい、あ、Ken、はい。
First of all, I have a question for Toru. Are you planning is it possible to publish Robert's talk in Japanese in the near future? I mean,
it's up to Robert. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
That's okay. I think this is important. How about Robert? どうですか？佐々木先生からの質問はこれを日本語で出版する計画はございますかということなんですけども。はい。
Oh, sounds good to me. I would very much like to.
Great.
Perhaps we can work together on that, Professor Sasaki.
Okay, yeah.
I like that too.
It's really my pleasure and honor. Yeah. Okay, great.
ぜひ。
Good.
I kind of want to follow a little bit since Ken mentioned. Sorry that there are other questions coming into first too, but one of the things when we started this project, it's been about more than a year ago. I asked Ken to join and give the comment about a year ago when we had an initial Zoom seminar. And Ken, I remember, really suggested me to a couple of publications that the art historian in Japan worked about the research they conducted about all these like fine art holdings or collections in like Boston and Europe. And then I remember that then he mentioned couple of things. So those art historians are into high art and high culture, and they saw anthropological collection is like something different. That's so like I thought that when how Robert prepared his talk, it's kind of he really made it in a contrast about those different about the focus with the collection with Noma and Knez and the private collection. Sorry, I'll translate. 私たちこのセミナーっていうか共同プロジェクトを始めた時っていうのがちょっと1年以上前だったんですけども、約1年前、ちょうど1年ぐらい前だったんですね。最初のオンラインセミナーをやらせていただきまして、その時に佐々木先生にコメンテーターで、それでロバートさんとポールさんが発表だったんですけども、大まかにこうスミソニアンの日本コレクション、もっとこう導入的なやつを準備してくださって、ビデオは見ることできるんですけども、その際にですね、準備している時の際に佐々木先生の方から私にこうコメントをくださったんです。で、その時はですね、あったのがその美術史の専門家の人たちが、いろんなこう海外にある日本の美術品の、調査、日本のあれですね、海外に渡った日本の手法とかいう感じでいろんなこう調査をずっと昔からされてるんですけども、その時の要するにハイカルチャーってですね、そういうものの、コレクションと、あと人類学的なものっていうのがある意味こうまた別個のものっていう感じのこう視点を美術史の人たちから見られてるっていうお話を聞いたことをこう思い出しまして、で今回ロバートさんの発表ではすごいその違いっていうのが自然史博物館の中であって、時代とかコレクションの背景が違うっていうのをこうとても今日話してくださったっていうのがこう私興味深かったです。すいません、本当はね、司会の私がいろいろ言ってすいませんです。はい。
I see a question in the chat. Perhaps I could address that first.
Okay.
Maybe I'll read it, Toru-san, and you could translate it into Japanese after. So this is from a question from Louise Court, who is this is a curator emeritus at formerly the Freer-Sackler Gallery, now the National Museum of Asian Art at the Smithsonian. It's a great question. Thank you, Rob, she writes. Is it possible to distinguish clearly in the documentation of the Perry collection between official gifts to Perry from the Japanese government and things bought by Perry's crew in local markets? For example, the Uchiwa fan with ukiyo-e print and perhaps an item of popular culture?
質問はですね、これはロバートさんへの質問なんだけど、まず、ルイーズ・コートさんは、スミソニアン研究機構の現在、サックラ東洋美術館、もともとはですね、フリーア美術館っていって、日本美術いっぱい持ってて、フリーア美術館、現在、サックラ、フリーア一つになってますけど、の、学芸員をですね、長く務めて、現在、名誉学芸員でいらっしゃる方です。で、ルイーズ・コートさんからロバートさんへの質問は、ペリーが、アメリカに持ち帰った日本の資料の中で、どれが、幕府から幕府が寄贈したもの、それから、ペリー提督のその、一行が、日本でね、買い付けたものとを、スミソニアンの残っている記録で区別することができますか？で、それで、今日のパワーポイントで最初に見せてくださった浮世絵が入っている日本のうちわ、これは単純に要するに普通の、民間のね、っていうか幕府が要するに慶喜がペリー提督に差し上げたものじゃなくて、むしろ民間のものじゃないですかというのが質問でした。
Yeah, that research has been done to the best of our ability to do so, and that was by Chung-Soo Hutchins. And it's in her book about the Perry collection I have here. And I will put the link to download this book into the chat just now. And the answer to the question is that yes, we can, for the most part, distinguish what items were purchased and what items were gifted. And that's contained in some lists in the appendix of this book. And for the particular item she mentioned, the uchiwa, that was actually one of the official gifts, not just something that they purchased at the market. There was 40 of them, and they don't have the most flattering descriptions by the Perry expedition crew members, but indeed those were official gifts from the Bakufu. That one, for example, was gifted, received during Perry's first visit to Japan in July 1853. So I hope that answers the question. And I will put the link to that, that book, which is on my colleague, Dr. Paul Taylor, who's present. It's on his academia page because he contributed to that book as well. So I'll put that in.
じゃあ、いきますか、すみません。
はい、
本件についてのその質問はですね、調査っていうのもすでに行われまして、チンス・ハチンで今からポールさんがチャットの方からポールさんじゃなくてロバートさんがチャットの方から、報告書の方のリンクを皆さんの方にと共有してくださるんですけども、このペリーコレクションの、調査についてはすでに行われてまして、どれが購入品だったのか資料でどれが贈品だったのかっていうのはその本の中の方に報告書の中の方に、もう分析が掲載されております。でそのうちですね、うちわ約40あるうちわについてはすべて贈品でありまして市場での購入ではございませんでした。1953年の最初の、7月のね7月ですね、最初のペリーの、来訪の時のに像で寄贈されたことということです。はい。すみませんです。You want to move to the second question from on the chat box, Robert, from Mary.
All right. Okay. So Mary McBride writes, that was fascinating. Thank you. We have connections to Japan during the Meiji period and with Commodore Perry. Now we are motivated to donate our inherited items from the Meiji period to the Smithsonian. Oh, well.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
チャットの方にあるマリーさんの方のコメントですけども、なんかとても興味深い内容でした。特に彼女の場合ですね、日本との、関係が明治時代との関係がありまして、で特にペリー提督との、関係もありまして、で今ちょうどスミソニアの方に寄付したいというふうにここで述べてくれてます。ありがとうございます。
すみません。
ありがとうございます。そうです。いつもありがとうございます。よ
ろしいでしょうか。
はい。
すみません。愛知学院大学の井上と申します。日本語でよろしいですか。
どっちでもいいですよ。
はい。すみません。じゃあ、ちょっと簡単にですね、すごいロバートさんの調査によってすごいコレクションの形成が分かって本当にありがとうございました。それで質問はこちらのコレクション当初その民族資料として分類されてそちらに収蔵されていると思うんですけれども、今コレクションを見た中で例えば漆のもの、漆器だとか刀剣だとか美術品として分類できるようなものもあると思うんですけれども、そういったものをその作品によってコレクション全体ではなくて作品の価値で例えば美術品は古着屋美術館に移管するとかそういったことはやっぱりされないというか、コレクションはコレクションとしてまとまった形でやっぱり考えられるっていうものなのか、その辺ちょっとお伺いしたいんですけれども。
The questions from Professor Inoue from Aichi Gakuin University. Like, thank you for the comprehensive presentation about on the Japan collection and the Smithsonian. So her comment and question is, it's probably in the beginning, it was, the collected as a more ethnographic, ethnological collection. But when you kind of look into it, like a lacquerware or swords and the knives, it's kind of turned into, or can be seen as a more art object. And her question is like, is there any kind of thing or management to see so this collection towards more theme or art space or ethnology based, kind of like, for example, like a transferring to freer, or keep it as a basically as a chunk group as when they are collected? It's how you presented in your talk.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Inoue, for the question. I would say that it's very unlikely that these items are going to get shifted around anytime soon, but they certainly have been moved around in the past quite a lot. And in the book that I linked to in the chat, Chung-Soo Hutchins gives a pretty good account of how this collection moved around before it finally ended up. Well, when she wrote the book, actually, she said it's finally ended its moving because it had ended up in the Natural History Museum. And actually, since then, it has moved off to an offsite storage facility called the Museum Support Center. But of course, it's still part of the National Museum of Natural History's collections. And there is certainly, well, perhaps Toru, you could translate. I'll stop there for a translation.
現時点ではおそらく動かないのではないかということなんですけども、過去ではいろんなところに博物館の中で、移管されたらしいです。で、そのことについてはちょうど今リンクを送らせていただきましたハンス・シャストンの報告書の方に書かれているらしいです。で、現時点ではですね、自然史博物館の方にあるの所属する倉庫の方に、保管されているということです。はい。
ありがとうございました。
Yeah, I would only add that, it does seem sort of odd for looking from the outside, perhaps, that some of these kinds of objects are in the Natural History Museum collections as opposed to the, art museum, the Asian art museums collections. But really, it's kind of, it's really, this is an outgrowth of the history of the institution and how these collections came into the museum. Like I said, with the Perry collection, it came in so early in the institution's history that there was no Asian art museum, let alone the Freer Sackler Gallery, like something like that didn't exist yet. So we're kind of lucky, I think, in that sense at the Natural History Museum to have such a broad ranging collection. That's kind of the answer I would give to the question. Unless Paul wants to add anything.
Is it okay? I can translate? おそらく外部の人から見ると確かに変わってるなと思うところもあるとは思うんですけども、やはりこの点っていうのはですね、歴史、自然史博物館と美術史のその違いというか、スミソニアン自体の歴史を反映しているところが収集の背景を反映しているところがあります。特にペリーコレクションなんかはですね、当時、自然史博物館っていうのはあったけども、フリーアーとかその美術史の方の博物館は当時なかったんですね。ですので、やっぱりその時の当時の歴史的背景、収集的背景、ある意味組織的背景ですね。そっちものっていうのが今でも反映されてしまっているところがあるということです。
そうですね。日本のものが海外にどういうふうに出ていって、どういうふうに見なされていたかっていうのを考える上ですごくその時代でどういうふうに収蔵されたかって見るのがすごく面白いなと思いました。
It's interesting. So it's like she said, it's interesting. Like there always a researcher focus on how Japanese artifact, left Japan, but kind of your presentation about how they are acquired institutionally. So different perspective here. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
ありがとうございます。 Oh, you have a comment? Yeah.
Well, I'm just following along and I agree with everything that Rob Pontsioen has said. He asked if I wanted to add anything on this topic. I will say that in America, all the natural history museums have anthropology departments. So unlike Europe, and I believe Japan has this system also where ethnology museums are separate from natural history. The natural history museums have always included anthropology, and that includes the standard four-field division of anthropology. So it's archaeology and cultural anthropology or cultural history, and linguistics and physical anthropology, the study of skeletal and physical or biological materials about humans. So in the 1850s and 60s, that study of natural history would have included anthropology as well. And actually right through the 1860s, to the 1890s and to about into 1910, the predominant study in both biological sciences and in ethnology was the evolutionary history of species. So the evolutionary history of societies was part of that as well. And people were collecting material from Asian cultures, partly because material objects were a proxy for ways to study the evolution of societies. And later, I don't know if this is correct, but I kind of get the impression that by the time Eugene Knez, my predecessor, was curator, a lot of work was done in village studies of material culture, partly because there was a strong sense of wanting to be very different from art museums. I mean, art would fit as part of culture as well, but sometimes you get a strong identity by not being somebody else. And anthropologists were getting a strong identity by not being art historians and collecting art. So these are just a few more observations.
はい、とても興味深い問題なんですけども、寺先生がおっしゃってくださったのは、ロバートさんの方に付け足す形なんですけども、北アメリカの自然史博物館には基本的に人類学の部局っていうのがついているのが基本的なフォーマットになっております。で、特にいつも多くのところですね。で、北アメリカの人類学というのは4分野人類学と言われまして、考古学、自然人類学、骨とかですね、生物学に入る方、そして文化人類学、民族学とも言われるフィールドです。そして言語人類学の4分野から成り立っています。で、1850年代から60年代のあたりにかけては、その自然史、的なものと、あと人類的なことっていうのがどっちも重なりながら言ってきたんですけども、特にその後の大体20世紀初頭ですね、1910年ぐらいまでになりますと、進化論時の、に関心があったその収集のものっていうのが多くなりまして、生物学とか民族学が混ざりながら収集っていうのが行われるようになります。で、その中でですね、物質文化的なものっていうのを収集することによって分析、も行っていくっていう取り組みがされてました。で、このユーゼンクニチ、その後ですね、戦後のこのクネズの取り組みなんですけども、人類学者っていうのはですね、先ほど佐々木先生の話もありますけども、やっぱり美術的なものっていうからは少し離れてですね、生活とかを見ることとかっていうのも強調するところもありまして、そのところからそのような民具とかそういうものの収集っていうのを取り組むようになったということが言われてます。はい。Interesting. Any question that we actually have Ken is an archaeologist, so he actually goes both back and forth, and also he's has a background in art history too, so kind of like a overlapping specialist here. Really happy to have him to be today's in today's session too. I have a question personally. So Noma, shipped Noma and the Knes sent two ship amount of product or artifact, but I don't know how large these products are or the artifacts are. But the question is, can you keep on acquiring object indefinitely in a practical manner? Like, how are you going to store, really, there's going to be a huge amount of object if you want to do extensive anthropological research or anthropological museum, if you want to hold. So my question is, 私の質問というのは、もしクネズやノマがやったような、要するにすごい生活の民具とかをずっと集め続けますと、確かに人類学的な博物館としてはいいんですけども、どういうふうにこのスペースをマネージしてくるかっていうのが質問になるんですけども、いかがでしょうか。Either Robert or Paul, you have a comment about?
Yeah. As a curator, Paul probably has something to say about this as well. But what I would say initially is just that collecting practices have changed dramatically, and that's probably part of the reason why. And like I said, the Perry collection, for example, and most of the ethnology collections from the Natural History Museum have moved out to an offsite facility that was built in part due to inadequate amount of space at the Natural History Building. When I said the shipment came over on two ships, it wasn't that both ships were full of the ethnology items. The shipment was just sent on two separate boats, but there were about 400 objects sent by Noma Yoshio, and some of them are quite large, and these things take up a lot of space. So this sort of method of collecting from the 1920s, for example, with the Julian James collection, where you would just, the museum would wholesale accept, entire, bequeathed items or entire estate items, or these big collections, is less likely to happen now because, there is just no, there's limited space for all of these kinds of things. Paul, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
Well, you have pinpointed a big dilemma we face in looking into the future. The fact is that if you are offered the full range of things that are potentially available to add to the collection, which could have some ethnographic or anthropological value to some research sometime in the future, that's, just massive numbers of ships full of things coming in just from Asia alone, clogging our ports are full of things that have some potential for research value. So there needs to be a different method of deciding what goes into a collection and what doesn't. And we have collections committees. I'm on the collection committee. And actually it works pretty well. Part of it is that we all don't try to collect everything. And we recognize that some things really belong other places. And, museums can share things, they can lend to each other. And that we often don't go out of our way to bring into the collection something that might be of research value in the future, but which would be easily available on the open market, because you can find on the internet or in the market of many countries things that we could put into our collection. At the same time, there are still big collections coming in, and you have to focus on the particular types of research that your museum's staff is doing. You look for strengths in your own collection that you want to build on. And sometimes you also look at things that are in danger. They would disappear if you did not put them into the collection. And that's a big issue in anthropology now. Somebody needs to take care of them. And if nobody else does, we can be a collection of last resort sometimes too. It's true for archives. It's true for objects. Yes, and working with other museums and locally with partnerships between museums in our different countries is great for this purpose.
特に学芸員というか、その収集実践についてっていうのは、スミソニアに関してはですね、スミソニアというか、自然史博物館はオフサイトファシリティ、その博物館からちょっと離れたところに一応所蔵庫っていうか、所蔵の建物っていうのがあるんですけども、やはりそれでも、限界がありまして、全てが集められるわけではないんです。で、ノマからクネーズの方に送られた、その収集物ですけども、約400からなって、船で2回送ったということですね。その2隻送ったってことではなかったということですね。で、特に、その後、ポールさんの方が述べたことっていうのも特にありまして、全てのものがですね、いつか将来的に人類学的な調査である価値がある可能性っていうのはあるかもしれません。ですけども、やはり収集っていうのは特に難しくて、どこまで入れるかって難しくて、でスミソニアンというか自然史博物館ではもちろん委員会を設置しまして、でそれで収集どこの判断をする決定作業というのを行っているということです。例えばスペースのことも考えまして、他の博物館に対応、貸し出しをしたり、あとは他の博物館と連携をしながら、ものをやっていった展示運営をやっていったり、あと例えば収集に関しては仮に他のところとかマーケットとかで入手できるかどうか、そうじゃないかってことを常に確認しながらやられているということでした。またコレクションとしてその博物館がどこに例えば強みを入れたいのか、でそういうことを常に入れながら委員会とか収集運営を今されているということです。はい。
May I add also, inside the Smithsonian, many things have been referred to us from the National Museum of Asian Art, the formerly FIRSAC, and vice versa. And we work together in many ways, and also with other museums. And when I say that we couldn't take everything, let me say that we're very grateful to people who are considering the Smithsonian in their plans. And we work with potential donors to talk about where their collections would most likely have the greatest impact and best use. If they're duplicate of what we have, we really still appreciate talking with people about that, and then suggesting maybe that they consider some other places where they're more likely to be used for current research and exhibitions. And sometimes we are able to, within reason, accept a small number of things every year. We just had a wonderful accession that was just completed a few months ago of a collection of Japanese swords and weapons, and that hasn't been cataloged yet or anything. But we are adding material. We'd love to do that. We'll just keep trying to find space however we can.
Perhaps that will be a topic of one of our future lectures, because this is a very fascinating collection of weapons.
And what makes it partly fascinating is it has good documentation, and that's very important. And the other thing I would mention for this webinar is, things that are of ancient history are very, very important, but also everyday things that we're using now, or that you have lying in the attic from the 19th century or the early 20th century. And I speak for every museum. If you have things like that or old photographs in the family, please, the young people need to take the initiative and write down from the elderly people while they're still alive and remembering things. Where did they get them? Where did they come from? Who's in that photograph? When was it taken? These are the kinds of things that make things so valuable. And I am sorry to bring this up, but very often we get wonderful material from the people who have just inherited it from the parents who passed away, and they don't know anything about where it came from. If only we had known that it was there in the attic 2 years earlier, they could have recorded all this valuable information. I'm sorry to bring this up, but I do think that's an important point.
まずね、スミソニアン、一番最初のところに戻るんですけども、例えばスミソニアンの中でも、博物館同士の連携については、例えばサッカーの美術館とか、と一緒にものを提供してくださったり、あと連携しながら作業をされてるらしいです。また、そのスミソニアンだけじゃなくて、複数の博物館ともいろいろ連携をされながら、いろいろ収集、そして管理運営に関わっているということなんですけども、あともう一つですね、この将来的なもの、寄付者の方々とも話し合いを持ちながら、方向性どこういうふうに収集していくかということも話し合いながら、収集とか連携をされているということでした。あとはですね、ちょうどその中でも数ヶ月前に日本のその刀と武具の、収集がかなり入ったということで、特にその今回のその武具に関してはですね、かなり詳細なデータ情報もつきながら寄付がされたらしいです。ですから、そのことについてですね、例えば将来的にセミナーとかを開いたり、皆さんにこういうことをお話ができたらということを、ロバートさんの方からありました。あともう一個はですね、ここで大事なことなんですけども、この情報とか、あれですね、その収集物に関する情報なんですけども、確かに古代のこととか古いこと、歴史上のことっていうのも大事なんですけども、同時にですね、例えば最近のもので押し入れにあるようなものっていうのでもとっても大事なことがいっぱいあります。例えば古い写真とか、家族の写真とかで、ご家族の方が他界された後にこれが見つかったっていう風になることっていうのも多いんですけども、その写真、例えばどこで撮れた写真だったとか、どのように入手したかっていうのが書類一緒に伴うととっても大事な情報、貴重な情報になりますので、もし何かそういうことがあったらですね、ついにメモを取ってしてくださるととてもいいかなと思うということでした。はい。Yeah. It's been 11:15 already. What's like the time flies so fast. Yeah. So thank you so much, I guess. Yeah, it was a really wonderful talk. Kind of like, as I mentioned, it's a really, precise and multi-layered kind of talk about Japan and like the history and actually museum management and a different focus about kind of not only the historical timeline of the museum acquisition but also management and the very, very various thing. 本当に今回の発表っていうのはご質問のことも合わせながらですね、本当30分の発表なんですけども、複数のテーマがあって、博物館に関わることですね。特に重層的な発表だったと思います。like that today talk, like we will upload the video later and accessible to you can watch it, you can use it. Then I'll send you the link when the site is available. そうだから後でビデオですね、がこの後録画したものっていうのをオンラインの方にアップしていつでも見られるような風にさせていただいていきますのでよろしくお願いします。後でリンクをお送りします。Robert and Paul, do you have kind of like the closing remarks?
Thanks, Toru, for all your hard work, and thanks for everyone for joining, and many thanks to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo also for their support and making this possible. And yeah, very much looking forward to our next events.
皆さんありがとうございました。特にアメリカ大使館の皆様、明治大学の皆さん、今回ありがとうございました。で、次回ですね、のセミナーも楽しみにしてます。次回はですね、年明けの1月11日でございます。Next time is the January 11th. In about a month, the presenter is Meiji University's anthropologist Kenji Yamauchi and his colleague. About it's a talk is about Meiji's expedition, anthropological expedition back in 1960 to Alaska. いや、次回はですね、1月11日になります。で、これはですね、アラスカ調査団っていうのが昔ありまして、そのことについてですね、明治大学の山内、の方から、人類学者の方からの報告になります。So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll meet you again in a month. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.